Did you know that coffee is actually a fruit? Yep. Before it becomes that roasted bean that we grind and we brew, coffee starts as a small, colorful cherry that grows on a tree. And inside the cherry, a complex journey from harvesting and processing to drying and exporting before it even reaches the roaster. Most people never think about what happens before coffee gets into their cup. But today, we are breaking it down. Where does coffee really come from? How do farmers turn these fruits into green coffee beans that eventually get roasted? And what makes one coffee different than another? By the end of this video, you will never look at your morning cup the same way again. So, grab your coffee and let's dive in. Alright, first thing we need to know is that coffee doesn't grow everywhere. Coffee plants are a bit dramatic. They need just the right mix of sunshine, rain and altitude to thrive. That's why coffee is mostly grown in tropical regions around the equator, in an area known as the coffee belt. And this belt runs across Central and South America, Africa, Asia and Pacific. Now, little parenthesis, there are some places where they are growing coffee that is not part of this belt, like for example in Denmark, but that requires a special technology that recreate the kind of environment that we find in this region. So let's say that coffee can grow everywhere, but naturally grows in this area. Within this region, coffee actually grows in between 600 to over 2000 meters above sea level. And why does altitude matter? Because higher altitude means cooler temperature, which slow down the coffee cherry's growth. Slower growth allows the beans inside to develop properly, which later affects the density, the quality and the complexity when roasted. Another thing we need to know is that coffee needs shade. In many places, coffee is grown underneath tall trees to protect them from too much sunlight. Some farms use a grown shade approach, where coffee trees are part of a natural ecosystem, and other farms use a full sun plantations to maximize the production. Another fact is that coffee isn't just a plant. There are different kinds of species, and the two most common are Arabica and Canephora, or Robusta. Arabica is the more delicate, high-altitude coffee. It's harder to grow because it's more sensitive to pests and also to climate change. But it makes up about 60 to 70% of the world coffee production. Canephora plant, or what we know as Robusta, instead is tougher, grows at a lower altitude and has more caffeine. And it's a species that is often used for espresso blends and instant coffee. There are also other species like Liberica, Excelsa or Eugenioides, but they are less common in the coffee production. Now let's talk about something that people usually don't think about. Coffee is a fruit. Yes, before it's roasted and ground, coffee starts as a small cherry growing on a tree. And just like any fruit, it has layers. We have the skin that is the outer layer, we can even call it exocarp, and when ripe, cherries develop different colors that can go from red to yellow or even orange. That depends on the variety. Then we have the pulp, the inside, where we have the sweet and juicy fruit layer, also called as a mesocarp. This part is often removed during processing, and we will see this in a second, but some producers use it to make cascara tea. Then we have the mucilage, and this is a sticky, honey-like layer rich in sugars. This is super important because it plays an important role in fermentation and processing methods. Then we have the parchment, and this is a protective shell that is around the beans, and it's also called endocarp. After that we have the silver skin, and that is a thin layer that remains attached around the coffee beans even after processing and comes off during roasting. And finally we have the coffee beans. Most cherries contains 2 beans inside, but sometimes we can have one singular round bean that is called pea berry. At this stage, coffee beans are still green and they don't have that kind of smell that we all know. That magic happens only later during roasting. Once coffee cherries are harvested, they go to a processing stage to remove all the layers surrounding the beans, so the skin, the pulp, the mucilage and the parchment, until only the green beans remain. This processing stage is very crucial because it influences everything from flavor development to quality consistency. And let's say that there are 3 main processing methods, each with its own impact on the final bean. The first one is the natural process, and it's exactly what it sounds like. Basically using the nature, so the sun and the wind, to dry the coffee cherries before removing the coffee beans. How it works? Freshly picked cherries are spread out on drying beds, patios or tarps. Farmers rake and turn the cherries several times a day to ensure even drying and prevent mold. Over 2 to 4 weeks, the cherries shrink and darken as they lose moisture, and the sugar in the fruit ferment naturally around the beans. Once fully dried, the outer husk is removed, leaving only the coffee bean inside. The pros of this natural process is that we use less water, so it makes this processing environmentally friendly, and also this process can create sweet, full-bodied coffee because the beans are able to absorb all the sugars from the pulp naturally. The cons of this natural process is that it requires a perfect weather conditions, because if there is too much humidity, we risk to have mold growing or even over fermentation. Also with this method, it's harder to control consistency, so defects can be more common. Natural processing is common in Ethiopia and Yemen, where dry, sunny climates make it easier to manage. In Brazil, instead, naturals are most commonly mechanically dried in within 12 to 24 hours in huge tumble dryers, which means there is no fermentation, so less fruity notes. Then we have the washed process. In this method, we remove the cherries and the mucilage right away, allowing the beans to dry on its own. This method is all about precision and clarity. How it works? First thing, after the cherries are picked, they go through a depulper, and here is to remove the skin and most of the pulp. Then we have the fermentation. Here the beans with the mucilage still attached are placed in fermentation tanks for around 12 to 48 hours. That depends on the processing. During this time, the enzymes naturally break down the sticky layer. Then we have the washing. So after the fermentation, the beans are washed and scrubbed to remove any remaining layer of mucilage attached. And then finally we have the drying, where the clean beans are spread out on raised beds or patios to dry until they reach the target moisture content. The pros of this washed process is that it produces a consistent and clean and bright coffee, and also it's easier to control the fermentation, so reduce the risk of defects. The cons of this method is that it uses a lot of water, which can be an issue in regions with limited supplies, and also the fact that it requires extra instruments and careful monitoring. The wash process is common in Colombia, Central America and Kenya, where water is more accessible, and also producers aim for clarity and high quality. Then we have the honey process, and this is a middle ground in between natural and washed. Instead of fully washing away the mucilage, some of it remains on the beans, while they dry. How it works? The cherries are depulped like it happens in the wash processing, but instead of being fermented in tanks, they are spread out on raised beds and naturally dry like in the natural process with the mucilage attached on the beans. Here farmers control how much mucilage is left on the beans, which leads to different types of honey processing. We have the yellow honey, and here is when minimal mucilage is left on the beans and also is dried a bit faster. Then we have the red honey, where more mucilage is left on the beans and also is dried a bit slower, and this creates a richer body. Then we have the black honey, where most of the mucilage is left on the beans and also it has the slowest drying, and this creates a very intense body. And of course, these beans are dried under a careful supervision to avoid over fermentation. The pros of this method is that add more sweetness and body to the coffee while keeping the clarity, and the fact that it uses less water than the washed process. The cons of this method is that it's more labor intensive because it requires consistent monitoring and also the risk of inconsistent drying if it's not managed properly. This method is widely used in Costa Rica and parts of Central America, where producers experiment a lot to create different kinds of flavors. Beyond these three main methods, there are other specialized processing techniques that some farmers use to create unique flavors. We have the carbonic maceration that is born from the wine making. Basically is placing the whole cherries in sealed tanks flushed with CO2 to control the fermentation. This results in highly complex and fruity flavors. Then we have the anaerobic fermentation. This is similar to the carbonic maceration, but the cherries are depulped before being placed in sealed tanks without the oxygen. This method produces funky and intense flavor notes. Then we have the wet hulled that is used in Indonesia. This method involves removing the parchment layer before the beans are fully dried. It results in earthy and full-bodied coffee with a distinctive character. Once the beans are processed, whether through natural, washed or honey method, they need to dry completely before being stored and exported. And drying is one of the most critical steps in the entire process, because coffee beans still have moisture inside of them even after processing. And if they aren't dried properly, they can mold, ferment too much, or even rot before making it to a roaster. So, how does drying work? Freshly harvested coffee cherries have a moisture content around 45 to 55%. That's way too high to be stable for storage. The goal is to reduce the moisture content down to 10 to 12%, which is considered the safe level for green coffee to be stored and transported without risk of spoilage. But if the beans are dried too quickly, they can develop cracks and lose quality. And if they dry too slowly, they can over-ferment or grow mold. So, finding the right balance is the key. There are different ways farmers and producers can dry coffee, and that depends on the climate, the farm size, and also depending on the available equipment. We have the most traditional way, that is the sun drying on raised beds or patios. Here the coffee beans or the cherries, depending on the kind of processing, are spread out on concrete patios or raised beds made of mesh, where workers rake the beans regularly to ensure even drying and avoiding molding and over fermentation. This process can take 1 to 4 weeks depending on humidity and temperature. Then we have the mechanical drying, and this is popular in areas where the weather can be too humid or unpredictable. Here, mechanical dryers helps to control the drying process. So instead relying on the sun, these machines use hot air at controlled temperature to gradually reduce the moisture content. This method is faster and can take only a few days, but if it's not done properly, can affect the shelf life of the green coffee. Then we have the combination drying. Here some producers start with the sun drying at the beginning and then finishing the drying in mechanical dryers to ensure consistency. This method is common in regions with high rainfall where relying on sun drying isn't always possible. So the drying process is very important because, as I said, the farmers and producers need to reach that level of moisture in between 10 and 12%, because if the level is above the 12%, the beans can develop over fermentation and mold, and that can create a problem in coffee flavors, especially when the coffee arrives to the roaster. And if it's too dry, so below the 10% of moisture, the beans can become too brittle, which affects how they react into the roasting machine. Over-dried coffee often ages too fast and loses the flavor complexity. To ensure consistency, producers and exporters check the moisture content of the beans before bagging them for export. Once the beans are fully dried and reach the ideal 10 to 12% of moisture content, they go through a final cleaning and sorting process before being bagged and shipped. Before coffee can be exported, it's sorted to remove defects like unripe beans, broken or chipped beans, beans with insect damage, or beans with mold or fermentation defects. This sorting can be done by hand for high-end specialty coffee or by machines that separate beans based on size, color and density. Today, almost every producer from commodity to specialty coffee are using dry mills with optical and density sorters to remove these defects. And it's because they say that today this technology is much better than hand sorting. Once sorted, green coffee beans are packed in burlap bags, usually in 60 kilos bags, but depending on the coffee there are also different ways, like for example for high-end specialty coffee they are in a smaller size and packed in vacuum sealed bags or even in Grain Pro bags, and this is to protect the beans from humidity and contaminations. After bagging, the coffee is shipped to roasters all around the world. Most green coffee is transported in cargo ships in large containers. Before shipping, exporters check the moisture content one last time because the journey is quite long, so to make sure that the moisture content is stable and at the right level so that we don't have surprise when the coffee arrives to destination. So a proper bagging and storage are essential. Once the coffee reaches a roaster, it's time for the final transformation, roasting. But that is for another video. Now, after all this work, harvesting, processing, drying, and sorting, you might be wondering, why do some coffee cost more than others? Well, coffee pricing isn't just about the brand or where you buy it, but it's deeply connected to every stage of production. That starts at the farm. For example, harvesting, we have the hand picking versus the mechanical harvesting. Hand picking requires skilled labors where workers select only the ripest cherries. They go back to the harvesting multiple times during the harvesting season, and this takes time, effort, and also cost more. Mechanical harvesting is often used in large size farms. It's faster but less precise, leading to a mix of ripe and unripe cherries, which can affect the quality and also, of course, the pricing. Then talking about the processing, we have the wash coffee where is used an extra amount of water, we have extra equipment, and also there is all this fermentation control going on. So of course this adds an additional cost to the coffee, but assuring consistency. For the natural process coffee, they rely on weather condition and also on a longer drying times. It requires more space and also labor turning constantly the cherries during this period. And with the experimental processes that take more time and precision make these coffees rarer and also pricier. For the drying as well, time and climate have a cost impact. If the coffee dries too fast or too slow, we saw that the coffee can be ruined. For the producers, they use mechanical dryers, so of course there is energy consumption and also the cost of the equipment. And for sun-dried coffee, workers monitor this drying process daily and this add labor cost. And the final price factor comes from sorting and quality grading. Like for example, specialty grade coffee has fewer defects, more uniformity, and the selecting is more precise. It also requires tasters, the Q graders, to taste the coffee and give it a score on a dedicated score sheet. Commodity grade coffee instead allows more defects and variability, and this means putting less effort into the grading, so a lower price. All these steps affect the final cost of the coffee that you buy. Like for example, for the mass-produced commercial coffee, the one that usually you find in the supermarkets tends to come from mechanized farms with a low-cost processing and faster drying methods. This keeps the price of the coffee low, but sometimes sacrificing quality. Then we have specialty coffee that is more labor intensive, carefully harvested, carefully processed, and all the sorting of the defects. And also specialty coffee usually comes from a small, independent and sustainable farms, all of which increase production cost, but with the result of a higher quality coffee in the cup. Then we have rare coffee varieties or experimental processing that requires more time and precision, making the coffee even more expensive. So next time you see a bag of coffee priced higher than usual, think about everything that went into making it. From hand picking the cherries to the processing, the drying time and the sorting, basically every single step that ensure a better and more consistent cup of coffee. In conclusion, the next time you're sipping your coffee, think about all the steps that happen before getting into your cup. From a small cherry growing on a mountain to the careful drying and sorting process. Every step matters. Now, I want to hear from you. Did you know coffee had to go through all these many stages before roasting? Also, have you ever seen green coffee before? Let me know by leaving a comment in the section below. Thank you very much for watching. I will see you in my next videos, and in the meantime, I wish you a wonderful day and delicious coffee. Ciao!